All right, welcome to the A's Philosophy YouTube channel. I am A's Philosophy, and during this video, we are going to be addressing the question: Did mitochondria originally exist as an independent organism, or as independent organisms, as the question appears? And the reason for this is actually that this question arose during a conversation I recently hosted on my channel about evolutionary theory. I myself reject the theory of evolution, but I hosted a conversation where another people who support or promote the idea of evolutionary theory came on, and one of the points that was raised was the idea that mitochondria are evidence for evolution because we can, according to the evolutionists, clearly see they originally existed as independent organisms and then got incorporated into modern cells by a sort of symbiotic relationship. And I actually wrote, I want to point out that I wrote a Substack article about that, which I will be showing because I investigated this matter. And I wanted to answer this question because even though it wasn't really a major point of discussion, it is one of those seeming facts that are believed and promoted by people who support evolution. And to me, it sounded very dubious and uncertain and unjustified based on the facts. And sure enough, I did my research and I found out that the idea of mitochondria basically becoming part of cells as a result of this symbiotic relationship is very questionable and probably almost certainly false for a number of reasons that I will get into. And I just wanted to put the facts out there. One of the main points of contention in the conversation was, is there any evidence that mitochondria can currently exist independently of their host organisms? To me, if if there is evidence of that, it would support very strongly the idea that they once existed as independent organisms and then became incorporated. But if they can't, and there's reasons to doubt that very strongly that there's any possibility of that, then to me, that would make the claims of evolutionists basically very speculative, not based on any sort of actual empirical evidence, and thus not scientific. And that would stand to support the basically the anti-evolution side, which says that there's no scientific reason to accept the hypothesis. So we're going to get into that. But first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to show you that I have a Substack article that I just wrote. It's my first Substack article in quite some time, but I put all of my research here. I did this pretty quickly, so it doesn't contain all the information that one might want for this for this study, but it contains does I think I do prove something very conclusively, which is that as we observe mitochondria now, there is simply no reason to think that they can exist independently of their host cells. So I just wanted to basically establish that mitochondria are entirely dependent, as it stands, as we observe them, on their host cells. And the only reason they're called host cells is because of the endosymbiotic theory itself. They really are just organelles within the cell. There's no reason to think they're anything other than that, essentially. And I think the main reason to believe that is because they can't survive outside of the cell they're in. And I put all of that. So we're going to look into that a little bit. All the information I garnered during my research is in the Substack article. If you go to Substack, it's A Philosophy USA, published on August 25th, 2025. And I have a number of scientific citations from scientific papers, basically proving without a question that mitochondria are absolutely 100% dependent on their host cells and host cell DNA. And we'll get into why that's a huge, huge, huge problem for evolution. And the base, it's especially for the idea of the endosymbiosis theory. But in any case, it does, even if you still want to believe an endosymbiotic hypothesis, you really can't deny after the facts that I accumulated in this article that you can't deny that mitochondria cannot exist independently of their host cells. They just can't. And that was a point of discussion. And they can't replicate. They can't. Most of their proteins are coded for. So we'll just take a look at that. Um, One is the first paper we're going to look at is mitochondrial evolution. This is just basically establishing some ground information about the idea itself. Mitochondrial evolution by Michael Gray, Cold Harbor, Cold Spring Harbor Perspectives. Just highlight really quickly. We'll go through this a few of these articles, just kind of showing you some of the information I accumulated in my research. We'll read this here, um, right here. Viewed through the lens of the genome it contains, the mitochondrion is of unquestioned bacterial ancestry, originating from within the bacterial phylum A, Proteobacteria. Okay, that's an assertion and has at this point absolutely no evidence to support it. So this is what a lot of these evolutionist based publications will do. They'll start off with their conclusion and really fail to support it in any meaningful way. But it does say this. Accordingly, the endosymbiont hypothesis, the idea that mitochondria evolved from bacterial progenitor via symbiosis within an essentially eukaryotic host cell, has assumed the status of a theory. So this is endosymbiont theory, and it's the going theory of how mitochondria became part of modern cells, eukaryotic cells, I should say, because mitochondria don't exist in prokaryotes. So we're really going to be talking about eukaryotes here. And by the way, I should note that every single eukaryote on Earth has mitochondria except for one observed instance. There's one basically unicellular eukaryote there that does not have any evidence of mitochondria in it. It was recently discovered, I found out. Up until a few years ago, they thought that it was 100% all eukaryotes, but they have found one type of organism of eukaryote that doesn't have mitochondria, but it generates its energy a different way, and it basically couldn't survive as a multicellular organism. Multicellular eukaryotes absolutely do require mitochondria. Actually, pretty much every eukaryote that has mitochondria requires them. So the mitochondria are necessary. Um, and then it goes into kind of the history of this idea, this publication, how it came to be accepted within science. It says in 1970, Lynn Margulis published "Origin of Eukaryotic Cells," an influential book that effectively revived the long-standing but mostly moribund idea that mitochondria and euplastids, chloroplasts, evolved from free-living bacteria via symbiosis within a eukaryotic host cell. The discovery in the 1960s of DNA within these organelles, together with the recognition that they contain a translation system distinct from that of the cytosol, were two of the observations that Margolis marshaled in support of the endosymbiont hypothesis of organelle origins. All right, so we see here that the two main ideas is that the reason scientists embrace this idea mainly is because mitochondria contain their own DNA, their own type of DNA, which is called mitochondrial DNA, and they have their own translation system to basically copy that and do things with it. So this has led some science, basically the field of biology, to accept that at some point these mitochondria were their own organisms because they have their own DNA. But I find this actually extremely poor reasoning, because when you're talking about creation versus evolution, the idea is that we have to have a reason for thinking that it was some other way. The mitochondria might have been designed this way. Just because mitochondria have their own DNA doesn't mean necessarily that they were originally something else. It just means that it could just mean that if we're asking ourselves if they're designed or not, for some reason the designer decided to design the mitochondria this way. For us to believe that mitochondria originally originated organisms, we have to establish a couple of things. One of them, could they even have survived outside of their host cells in any meaningful way? Well, let's try to ask that question, because if they can't, then why should we assume that it was anything other differently, except because of the presupposition of evolution itself? So that's what I'm going to get into now. We have a publication here in Biomolecules by, it's called Nuclear Mitochondrial Interactions by Brittany Walker and Carlos Rice. Let me see if I can get my information here. Where is it? There it is. All right. Sorry for the delay. I just want to make sure I have everything here. So this is what this publication is saying about mitochondria. The cell's major energy producers also act as signaling homes, interacting with other organelles both directly and indirectly. Despite having its own circular genome, The majority of mitochondrial proteins are encoded by nuclear DNA. Right there, you have it. So this was one of the questions that I was asking the evolutionist: is is everything necessary for the mitochondria contained within its own genome? And it seemed to me that the answer was basically yes. And I was contending with this. I felt strongly that most of the mitochondrial DNA is not held within the mitochondria itself, but most of it is encoded in the nuclear DNA. Now, if that's the case, that obviously immediately raises a huge problem, because the mitochondria would at that point obviously require being part of the cell, because the cell has the nucleus outside of the mitochondria. And if most of the mitochondrial DNA is in the nuclear DNA, then you can't get a mitochondria outside of the cell itself. So this was one of the major points of contention, and here we have the proof in this, basically, that yes, mitochondria. It just says here the majority of mitochondrial proteins are encoded by the nuclease. So that right there just kills the whole idea, because if they can't, the proteins themselves are what make up the mitochondria. So if they're encoded in the nuclear DNA, then a mitochondria literally cannot exist outside of the host cell. It just can't, because it doesn't have the physical apparatus to be a mitochondria. It doesn't have the elements of it are coded in the DNA. It's like if you're trying to make a human self-existent, but all of its DNA is encoded. Its head, its lungs, its organs, all its arms, legs, all of it is encoded somewhere else. Well, it's going to be dependent on another thing for its existence. Same thing with mitochondria. It can't exist on its own. It can't self-replicate, because most of it's without the apparatus of the nuclear DNA. So this here we are here we're having established right here that a vast majority of the um, we're going to learn how much soon here. Uh, so there's other papers here that I have. This is a paper from J. Apple Gennett. Nuclear genes involved in mitochondrial diseases caused by instability of mitochondrial DNA, led by Ruseka et al. And there's some interesting things being said here, but we're going to skip most of it. Just get to the point that I wanted to highlight. This is going to be a little complicated, but it's necessary to answer this question for people who are interested. In humans, so basically, let's go up here. Let's start up here. In the same year, Schatz isolated mitochondrial DNA from this organism. And here it is. Mitochondrial DNA is required for production of key catalytic subunits of the mitochondrial respiratory chain complexes, and therefore is essential for oxidative ATP production. And in humans, it is a circular molecule of 16.5 kilobytes carrying only 37 canonical genes. All right, so there you have it. In humans, mitochondria, its own DNA codes for 37 genes. Well, how much is that compared to all the genes it needs? So here we get that answer shortly thereafter. All other proteins, over 2,000, required for the proper function of all mitochondrial bacterial pathways, including the rest of the subunits of respiratory complexes, are encoded by nuclear genes. So wow, we had 37 encoded for by the mitochondria itself necessary for its function. Over 2,000 of the mitochondrial genes are encoded for by the nuclear genes. So that's pretty much all of them, which is absolutely horrible for the idea that these things were, because that's if you do the math, that's over 99.9% of genes are encoded for the mitochondria on the nuclear genes, which means that almost everything comes from nuclear genes, which means that if mitochondria are originally self-existing organisms, that means almost every single gene that they originally had on their own was somehow basically transported to the nuclear genes over time and became functional. And the genes were able to transcribe them and use them to. The idea that happened in any evolutionary timeline is absolutely absurd and preposterous, because you really have to ask, there had to be time periods where some of this stuff wasn't functional as the genes were being transferred or whatever. And the idea that it all just happened magically, where everything was working, where they were just kind of transferring genes back and forth, and things were still working, it really doesn't work when you really think about it. Really, the most parsimonious explanation is that this is the way it's always been. This is how it was originally designed. Most of the genes are on the nuclear DNA. They've do not have any evidence that these genes were once part of the mitochondria. This is all we've ever observed. And when you have 99% of the genes for the mitochondria being coded for in the nuclear DNA, you're going to have to, it's really hard to believe that originally that those were all part of the mitochondria. And of course, the evolutionists will obviously say, well, it wasn't always like that. You know, it happened over time, or the mitochondria were simpler. They didn't require as many proteins. Whatever the case, what we're observing is that in humans, and but also we're going to find in other organisms that let me see and make sure here. Yeah, that in other organisms, I saw another site that said that basically it's always over 95% in every organism. So I forgot, I lost that quote, but it's in there some. It's out there somewhere that 95 in humans is 99.9%, but 95% or more is pretty typical from what I was seeing. So that is really pretty bad, pretty bad for the endosymbiont hypothesis. We're going to get to one more here. This is mitochondria nuclear crosstalk and environmental molecular mutagenesis. Let's try to zoom in a little bit so we can see what we're talking about. Let's see what I had here. Um, yeah, let's read this. This is from, let's just make sure we did from Darfarin. We already read all that, just so you know where I'm getting this. Introduction. Communication between the nucleus and mitochondria is bidirectional, ensuring cellular homeostasis through continuous exchange of signaling molecules, proteins, and metabolites. This dynamic interaction is fundamental to mitochondrial DNA maintenance, coordination, metabolic adaptation, and cell survival. So basically, it's saying the nucleus is necessary for the survival of the cell and the maintenance of the DNA. The nucleus exerts control over mitochondrial function through anterograde signaling, a process that regulates mitochondrial DNA replication, repair, and biogenesis in response. So look at this. This is really key. The nucleus exerts control over mitochondrial function through anterograde signaling, a process that regulates mitochondrial DNA replication, repair, and biogenesis in response to cellular demand. So basically, the mitochondrial DNA require the nucleus to replicate. Again, this is basically all demonstrating a codependence of the mitochondria on the nuclear DNA. They can't replicate on their own, which means they can't survive on their own. And the theory requires that the mitochondria at one point be able to survive on their own. But based on what we know about the current biology of the cells, that's just not possible. And there's no evidence it's possible. They never observed mitochondria just existing on their own. They've observed them outside the cell in certain situations. But it's basically like a human being shot into space. Okay, yeah, it's going to survive for a short period of time, but they're not going to last for very long, and they're certainly not going to, be able to reproduce and be self-existent in space outside of, the Earth's atmosphere. Same thing with mitochondria. There are certain rare instances when they get basically ejected out of the cell and they do things and can get incorporated back in. But at the end of the day, they won't exist. They can't exist on their own independently of the cell as an independently living organism. All the stuff that they need to replicate, repair themselves, and basically generate themselves is encoded in the nucleus. And the nucleus controls all of that. Um, this regulation is primarily mediated by nuclear encoded mitochondrial targeted proteins such as transcription. I'm not going to read all that. But it says it collectively drive mitochondrial DNA replication and sustain mitochondrial integrity under those basal and stress conditions. Uh, um, so let's see what else we have here. There's more here. Um, Given the mitochondria's central role in cellular homeostasis, disruption of mitochondrial biogenesis pathways contribute to metabolic disorders, aging, and various mitochondrial diseases. The regulation of mitochondrial biogenesis is primarily driven by nuclear encoded transcriptional factors that moderate the expression of mitochondrial proteins required for oxidative phosphorylation, mitochondrial DNA replication, and metabolic adaptation. So here again, this is key. It's the nucleus, the nuclear encoded transcriptional factors are governing mitochondrial DNA replication. So again, this is a question that was asked. It's being answered right here. No, the DNA. It doesn't seem like the mitochondrial DNA can replicate on their own because there are nuclear encoded transcription factors that basically govern all that. So the idea that the mitochondria might slip out of the cell and then become their own organism and be available for an endosymbiotic relationship is just non-existent. It's not even close to fathomable given this information. Uh, Mitochondrial biogenesis requires precise coordination between nuclear and mitochondrial genomes to maintain balance of nuclear encoded proteins, which are essential for mitochondrial function through proper import and integration into mitochondrial compartments. And it goes on and on and on. And I could give more information, but I think I've made my point, and I don't want the video to be too long. I just wanted to prove what conclusively that the biology, the facts of biology are currently that. Let me go back to this. That mitochondria simply cannot exist independently of the so-called host cells. And to call them host cells is based on the endosymbiotic theory itself. They really are just the cells. They are organelles within the cell. That's all they appear to be. They don't appear to be these independently existing organisms. They certainly aren't now. And the fact that they aren't now means that any stories that are told about them being in the past are just basically pure speculation, conjecture, especially when you take into consideration the extent to which mitochondria are currently dependent on the eukaryotic cells and the chromosomal DNA. It's just uh, the idea that someone is claiming that these things can exist independently of the cell, that has at the very least been refuted. But I would also argue the theory of evolution itself. All this information that I found is so bad for evolution. I think it almost goes so far as to overthrow the entire theory because the mitochondria are absolutely necessary for all these different types of eukaryotes. And there arises a question of, well, the cells can't really generate energy and thus can't survive without mitochondria, but mitochondria can't uh, exist without the cells either. So it creates this chicken and the egg problem that really doesn't seem to be explicable in terms of evolutionary mechanisms and this gradual building up. So the evolutionists tell these stories about how things were different a billion years ago. The mitochondria and the cells themselves were much simpler. But and the mitochondria didn't need the host cells at that time. It was just part of a relationship they were having with the host cells, and eventually they became incorporated. Another thing is that the nuclear DNA is going to have to, in my opinion, generate the replacements for the mitochondrial DNA. If you think about the mitochondrial DNA losing most of its own DNA, it has to be replaced. Now, how would that happen? Could it just be transferred over to the nuclear DNA? If so, how would that work? How would that look? Is that something we've observed? Or, the main mechanism proposed by evolutionary scientists is that, you know, uh, genetic mutations in the nuclear DNA give rise to these proteins, which are then usable by the other elements of the cell. So, are we really going to argue that random genetic mutations magically found all of these necessary proteins to code for mitochondrial organelle elements? Of course, that seems just flatly impossible. If you know anything about the mathematics of protein generation and how many mutations that would require to sort through that many proteins of that level of specificity. It really is impossible. It's mathematically impossible. There's no reason anyone should believe it in and of itself. So these are a couple things that if you go to the Substack article, it has more details. It's all more synthesized in a way that probably is more readable. This video went a little bit longer than I thought, but anyways, I think I've answered a couple questions. I won't necessarily have falsified evolution entirely, although I do believe that this is very bad for evolution. But I think that anyone who's wondering if mitochondria, if there's evidence they can currently exist independently of modern cells, unfortunately, well, for them, the answer is absolutely no. The answer is no, not in any case. They're totally dependent on the nuclear DNA and the the cells in which they exist. So I'll leave it there and hope this was helpful. Thank you.